All right. Can I briefly introduce our panel? Do you mind? Okay, great. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel just so you understand how intimidating it is for me to be talking to them. So real quick, let me just set the table by saying cyber is obviously at this point not a niche technical problem, hasn't been my whole career, hasn't been any of their whole careers either. It's a governance issue, and we're finally recognizing that. It's an infrastructure issue, it's a legal issue, and increasingly it's a public trust issue. And at the same time, your answer can't just be fear, although as a lawyer I do recommend fear. It also has to include resilience and practical mitigation, and a realistic conversation about what digital sovereignty can mean in a country like Canada. So this panel brings together three different viewpoints, distinct but complementary. We have Sami Khoury, to my right, who is with the Government of Canada and is also one of the sort of founding persons in our whole cyber community. He formerly ran the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. And he brings the government's view on the evolving threat environment and resilience. We have Charles Noir, who's with CIRA and brings perspective of an operator working on internet infrastructure, DNS abuse, practical mitigation. And we have Dr. Emily Laidlaw, who brings legal, policy, and training lens, including what reasonable safeguards and overdue law reform should look like in a fast-moving and threat environment. So with all that said, and I hope you guys are going to have questions because, get your money's worth. Let me start with Sami. Sami, from your government-wide vantage point, where do you see the most important cyber risks evolving right now across public systems, critical infrastructure, and so on? And what should organizations be doing today to build resilience rather than just sort of reacting to bad news?
Here. Thanks, Brent. Glad to be here, and maybe I'll echo the fear message a little bit before I get into what should people do. So the threat landscape is real, and it's getting more and more sophisticated by the day. We often talk about, the nation states. We talk about cyber criminal. These are things that haven't changed. We talk about ransomware getting more and more sophisticated. But there are also elements of threats that are evolving very, very rapidly. So the first one would be AI, and we can't have a conversation today without talking about AI, on both sides of the spectrum. So AI is a capability that is sort of enabling both the defense and the offense, but it's also moving at a very, very fast speed. Who would have thought that, 6 months ago we thought, criminals and nation state will use AI kind of so. Now we see campaigns almost entirely run by AI. And then we also have, if we look further down the path, the evolving threat from a quantum perspective, and the window around quantum keeps shrinking. So even though we put out advice from a government perspective around timelines like 2031, 2035, Google updated it and said 2029. So the window is kind of shrinking. So these are some of the threats that are out there. And we talk about them, we're well informed about them. And the important thing is that organizations, big or small, have to take that seriously. I mean, I think our biggest enemy after the threats is complacency. And that's something that I worry about a lot, that companies say, well, why would anybody come after me? And actually, they're coming after you because they find an opportunity to come after you. They don't come after you because you are who you are, especially around the small and medium business. That becomes a bit of a problem when complacency sets in. And the reality is that a lot of basic things make a difference. I mean, we don't have to. Basic hygiene matters. Basic hygiene like patching, basic hygiene like passwords, get complex passwords, know your assets. Raising the bar on making it difficult for a cyber actor does make a difference, because they'll try once, they'll try twice, they'll move on to somebody else. So the idea is we want to make it difficult enough that they move somewhere else, and ideally that somewhere else is somewhere outside of Canada, not here. So when we talk about cyber, at times it feels a bit intimidating because and there's maybe a misconception that you have to spend a lot of money to build that resilience. And my argument is that sometimes you don't have to spend a lot of money. Depends where you start, but if you make a difference with some of the basic things, it will make it more difficult for actors to find a way to get into your systems.
Absolutely. I'm still seeing a lot of the vulnerabilities that I, as a data breach coach, end up mopping up after are patches that weren't implemented a year after they were available and so forth, basic things. And I'm sorry for smiling like an idiot while you were talking about serious things, but when you said cyber hygiene, Wendy started making a show of checking her deodorant. So, and then that made me think I should, but I'm on camera, so I'm not going to do that. And always the bad ones sit in the front row. Charles, how does what Sami's seeing line up with what you're seeing from the CIRA side as an operator? Talking here about, infrastructure, I guess, and well, just what's coming across your desk. And if you don't mind, maybe you could start, because I didn't do this, explaining a little bit more for anyone that doesn't know what CIRA does, because you're a vital part of the ecosystem, but I think not one that people hear about as much as they should.
Great. Also pleased to be here. This is my first digital access day in person, so it's great to be here, and thanks for having CIRA. Just really quickly, CIRA is the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. We're responsible for the infrastructure behind the country code top level domain .ca. So any domain that you use on the internet that ends with .ca, we're responsible for making sure that you can connect to that particular one and only domain, and that domain is legitimate. It's not fraudulent, for example. And we do that by running something called the domain, we are an operator of the domain name system, the DNS. Really quickly, don't glaze over on me. We remember names as human beings, so CIRA.ca, that's something you're going to hopefully remember when you go home today, but you're not going to probably remember the IP address that the machines are using to get to each other to distribute that information. So the machines behind the internet, or through the internet, through the plumbing, are using long numbers, IP addresses, to understand who they should reach out to and what information they should pull back to you. But we, as human beings, are better at remembering names. So we have this system that translates the name to the number and then gets you to where you need to be. I hope that was probably as far technically as we want to go. So that infrastructure is invisible, and it should be invisible, and it's complicated, and it's global, and it runs all the time, and there's billions and zillions and trillions of signals ripping across the network at any given time, trying to ensure that those resolutions, those DNS resolutions, are taking place. And so one of the things that we offer Canadians free of charge, and Sami talked about, not everything is going to be costing money to to take cybersecurity into your own hands, is Canadian Shield. And that is a product and a service that any Canadian can download. And what that does is it uses that system to block threats that might be working in that invisible layer. So if you're trying to connect to a website that might be CIRA.ca, but somehow has become malicious, or there's something happening that you're not aware of, that system will block it, okay? So in terms of what Sami's talking about, we are seeing the industrialization of abuse. We call it DNS abuse. People using that system against what it's supposed to be using for. They're using it to do phishing. They're using it to distribute malware. To give you a sense, we have about 3.5 million Canadians on the platform that are using that. We're very proud of that. A number of those, about 500,000, are using a protection service layer of that. And in a year, at any given point, we're seeing about 2 trillion resolutions happening through that system. So that's a fair amount of resolution. Tells you there's a lot of activity. And we're seeing about 2 billion blocks. So over the past year, before I came in today, we looked at a year's worth of data. So we are seeing an increase in the blocks that are happening. On our other side, in the industrial side, we do provision these for a fee, this type of service, to about 4,000 organizations with about 4 million people there. We're seeing 18 billion blocks last year. That's a lot for us. I mean, if you get into large protectors that are doing this globally, you're going to get into some numbers that you would have a lot of trouble believing. But from our perspective, from an operator perspective, Those threats are increasing. They're increasing for the reasons that Sami said, because of AI, automation, industrialization of abuse. This is no longer about a few people working together. This is about a few people working together, perhaps across the globe, using very sophisticated technology to do this at scale.
Thanks. As a small business owner with two .ca domains, I'm glad you mentioned Canadian Shield, and it's not going to come up again in our conversation possibly, but for what it's worth, there's a lot of great resources for small and medium-sized businesses that I think not enough of them know about. CIRA is doing great work. The Canadian Cyber Centre has a lot available as well. I send my clients to them. Speaking of clients, Emily, you and I are lawyers that practice in this space, although you're smarter than me. One of the issues that always comes up when you're advising clients in the cyberspace, I find, is what's expected of me? What do I have to be doing to be fulfilling my obligations? Tough to do when you're dealing with an environment that's changing by the hour. What would you say in terms of what is good enough? How do organizations even assess where they are on that in terms of, am I fulfilling my legal obligations? Maybe you can start a little bit by what those legal obligations even look like.
Yeah, thank you. And Brent, jump in at any point. We like to sit and talk law quite a bit. And of course, that's kind of narrowly where I come into this particular area. And I was thinking of this stat given in the earlier panel that 98% of Canadian companies are small and medium-sized enterprises. And that has an enormous impact on the Canadian landscape when we're looking at sort of their maybe where their investments sometimes when it comes to reasonable security safeguards. I mean, they're trying to just keep the lights on. And it's surprising the number of even, I'd say, medium-sized organizations that have huge turnover and are highly vulnerable in terms of cybersecurity that don't have the most basic practices in place. So you should go and hug an IT guy at every opportunity, because they're fighting with executives trying to bring home what that threat is, without the resources and without the commitment of it being a top priority. And so I laughed slightly last week when the announcement was made about Mythos and the huge risk and the AI risk that Sami was talking about, and how everyone really needs to double and triple down on their cybersecurity defenses. And I thought, my God, we're still so far behind when it comes to some of the organizational commitments to that. And so some of this is about building up that understanding and capacity at an executive level to then have that trickle down. Now, I am fully not answering the question that you asked, but this is top of mind of what I just wanted to get that out there, because this has sort of been, this is what you're facing on day-to-day basis when you're advising these organizations, or when you're rolling in when the data breach has happened. And you are kind of, if their plan hasn't been in place and they haven't reached out to you until it's happened, then you're facing a situation where you're putting out fires without any of the plans in place or any of the protections. So what are the reasonable security measures? I mean, if you're advising a private company in Canada, you're either dealing with PIPEDA or PIPEDA. Ask different people and they pronounce it different ways at a federal level, and then various provincial private sector legislation. Of course, there's different public sector laws, and it is in dire need of reform. We had a bill on the table. Of course, it died with prorogation. There'd been a lot of feedback about it, and it was, so I'm hoping, especially too with some of the kind of hints and comments earlier today, that we will see a reintroduced private sector privacy law hopefully soon, because it makes it difficult to advise companies on what their reasonable security safeguards are. What we are piecing together is essentially guidance through various investigations by federal and provincial privacy commissioners, where they're identifying both the technical and organizational and kind of physical measures that have been put in place to reach what they've seen as just an adequate level. But what is wholly unanswered right now is, what does a reasonable level of security look like given the threats that we've talked about so far today, and Sami's talking about quantum and he's talking about AI, what can we advise an organization where you say for compliance purposes, because we want to kind of push aside any overly complex requirements, but just on a basic level, what do you need to do to achieve that? And that's not an easy thing to advise on right now, and almost double difficult when we think of the SME environment. Do you have anything else to add on the legal side on this?
Thank you. That's great. I have two things. One, Bill C-26 is now Bill C-8 and is in the Senate. It sailed through as far as parliamentary speed goes, it sailed through the House of Commons, largely the same bill that we had last time. So it's working its way through the Senate. We should have a federal bill soon. So, third parliament's the charm, I guess. Absolutely right in terms of the lack of guidance, because I've been doing this for over a decade. There's still almost no case law. Because in the absence of statutes just laying out explicitly, here's what you have to do, it gets determined on a case-by-case basis, and then you have an accretion of case law that sets out, this is what you should have. We have very little of that in Canada. Most of what we see attempting to build law in that space is class actions, and almost none of them have ended up going forward. So we're still reading the tea leaves. We're relying on American case law and so forth to give us some indication. I should also say, for any IT people out there who are now experiencing an unsolicited hug, that's on us. But, enjoy it. Charles, let's take this back to a bit more of a technical level, away from a legal level. What are the threats that you're most worried about now when it comes to the DNS and related systems? And what sort of practical mitigations are underway, are being implemented? You talked a bit about what CIRA is doing in this space. I know you've touched a bit on this, but maybe you could give us a bit more.
Sure. Thanks. Just to clarify that my role is VP of Policy and Advocacy and Net Good, which is a give back program we have. So I understand some of the tech behind here, but I'm not an engineer. So I'm going to look at other folks in the room who really get the tech. Sami being one of them. Look, I'll go back to what I originally said, and some of what we're talking about here. I think we're moving into an era, obviously. Can't not talk about AI, as Sami was saying, where we're starting to see the ability to automate and discover vulnerabilities or to defend, hopefully, being something that has such a capability that used to rest perhaps only with, not 10 years ago with very sophisticated actors and nation states, I would argue increasingly becoming available to bad actors and individuals in a way that I don't know if we're entirely prepared for, to be honest with you. So for us at the DNS layer, we're very concerned about what we're seeing there and how that's going to impact. And we don't really, to be honest, know because things are unfolding and capabilities are unfolding so quickly. But we do see that rise. And so the way that I look at this is, there's things that we can do personally, and we talked a little bit about Shield, and that's not by far the only technical solution. And then there's education, and we'll get to that later. But as an industry, as an operator, CIRA is working with other operators around the world. There are about 250 to 300 CCTLDs that have the country code behind it. And there are about 1,200 to 1,500 generic top-level domains, .com, .net, .org, all of that. We have different contractual agreements and we have different relationships with governments and ICANN, which kind of manages the technical core of a lot of this domain space. But I will say that we're coming together increasingly on our own outside of contractual agreements in order to address some of this DNS abuse because it's proliferating so quickly and it's because it's so problematic. And because we also believe that operating those pipes and operating that infrastructure, we have an obligation to address some of it. It gets a little tricky when we're talking about content versus technical abuse. Won't touch that right now, but there's a lot of work we're doing. So we're working in new forums. One of them is called the Internet Infrastructure Forum, which is bringing together not only DNS operators, hosting providers, ISPs, big tech, and we're recognizing that the problems we might be solving at a DNS layer also need to be solved at a hosting layer, also need to be solved in a tech layer and in the tech space. So there's a lot of work going on between companies and between both profit and nonprofit. That's really important. We're working with the Government of Canada. Canadian Shield ingests a very important threat feed from the CCCS. So there's work going on there. And then, of course, there's contractual hardline progress. It's a bit slow, but that's increasingly becoming part of the toolkit.
Probably the lawyers are holding up that contract bit. You make a good point about bringing Sami into the conversation at this point. First of all, thank you for that. And I think I'm probably not the only one who's surprised and relieved to hear about all that activity happening on that voluntary basis at the operator level. Sami, can you sort of contextualize for us how big, how important a piece is that operator-led initiative in the overall project of sort of cyber resilience? Because I think when ordinary Canadians think about this thing, they probably think this is the government's job. So what's this ecosystem look like, and how big a piece is the operator-led piece?
I would say it's hugely important. The government cannot solve Canada's cybersecurity problems by itself. We have a role to play. We have a role in informing. So the Cyber Center that I used to run, defends government. So that's our job one. Our prime directive is to protect the government of Canada and all of the systems that are housed there. The CRAs, the ISADs of the world, all of the government departments benefit from a layer of cybersecurity that the Cyber Center has. Outside of government, we don't have a stick, but we have the sort of the power of convening and also the power of informing. So trust us in saying that when we issue an alert or when we issue an advisory, that advisory is sort of authentic and well informed. But we need everybody to contribute to making Canada safer. The operators play a huge role, so CIRA plays a huge role, and that's why we're contributing to Canadian Shield with Avantail, our threat feed. But the telcos have a big role, the energy companies have a big role, the banks have a big role. And while we cannot talk to each company and each organization individually, we use kind of sectoral groupings to share with them what we know that is specific to their sector. But every opportunity to amplify, one, the threat, and two, the mitigations that come along with those threats. I mean, there are things that can be done to mitigate threats, but it kind of varies depending on the sector. But it is absolutely the cliche. It's a teamwork, and everybody has to be on that team. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. You often hear the phrase with defenders, cybersecurity is a team sport, which those of us that hated gym class, we're sorry to hear that, but here we are. I'm going to get into one of the two topics that we're required to address on every panel. So we're going to talk digital sovereignty now. I was going to start with you, Charles. I think I'm going to start with Sami, and then I'm going to come to each of you. And so let me tell you, just to save us a mic pass, here's what I'd like you each to sort of help me out with. First of all, Sami, what do you, and I don't know if you could speak for the government at this point on this, but at least tell us what you think we're talking about when we talk about Canadian digital sovereignty in terms of what's actually possible here in terms of the overall picture. Emily, I'd like you to tell us what sort of stands in the way of that, or what helps us when it comes to dealing with the jurisdictional issues, because we're sitting inside a complicated legal framework and an international sort of framework as well. And then Charles, what's actually doable at the technical level? And I know that you're not an engineer, but I mean, I'm sure these are conversations that you're having at CIRA. What's actually practical with what we have now?
So about, I would say, last October, September, October, the government Treasury Board convened a bit of a round table of associate deputy ministers to talk about, or at least to try to frame, what do we mean by digital sovereignty? And we went back and forth on definitions, from legal definitions to dictionary definitions. And at the end, we settled on a paper that is published on Canada.ca. So if you go on Canada.ca and look for digital sovereignty, you'll see where is the government thinking about that. So this is not a policy, it's not a regulation, it's a thinking piece. And it can be summed up to, the government position on digital sovereignty is having autonomy over our digital assets, our data, our intellectual property. So the tech stack, what makes us digital is everything from networks to servers that have memory chips, that have hard drives, that have CPUs, to software that runs on those. It is not about everything at every layer being built in Canada. So digital sovereignty is not about where the technology is built, but it is about, do you own the stack and can you control the stack, both for product and for services too. So is your IT managed by a company that is not in Canada? So that, that would be maybe contrary to digital sovereignty. Is your data stored in a data center that is not in Canada? That also would play into the concept of digital sovereignty. So until you can answer yes to or no, depending on the questions, but until you can demonstrate that you own and you have autonomy over that stack, you have not achieved sort of the concept of digital sovereignty. And we're encouraging everybody to revisit their IT stack, to their contractual obligation, their legal obligation, and figure out, is there fine print, and this is where the two of you can come in and offer an opinion. Is there any fine print in any of that language that maybe, removes my autonomy over my systems, over my data, over my intellectual property?
Is it to me or Charles? Aha. Okay. So I think I've been thinking about it in terms of then how do you layer on top of that the idea of what legal sovereignty looks like. And there are a couple challenges, and they're not necessarily challenges. I'd say as a starting point, if we go way back when, the internet was built on the idea that of the free flow of information. And so internet governance was really built out of the idea that this was about multi-stakeholder governance. It wasn't just about one country. And it was about a lot of shared practices that were really beyond law because of the understanding of the global nature of what we were facing. The other is the role of hard law, and we haven't got much further from some of the early jurisdictional cases from the 1990s. And I think of one of the very first cases was about a Yahoo message board that was selling Nazi memorabilia in France, and that is illegal in France, but it was a US-based company. And it was before geolocation, and the courts were like, well, you should really come up with something to sort of like figure out the countries that people are in. And it was about the enforceability of this type of legal requirement on an American-based company. But the laws haven't particularly evolved when it comes to that, I'd say, skirmish between some of the American laws and all jurisdictions, but in particular, some of the differences between American laws and other countries. So for legal sovereignty for Canada, it really has then two features here. And one is we are a country that can pass our own laws to protect Canadians. And the other is it does need to be, I'd say, interoperable with other countries because no matter what we do, tech is global. So what does that look like? Sometimes it is that if there are certain common approaches that are seen as the gold standard for addressing some of the issues that we're looking at, that our laws and our reforms mimic that in some ways, but also are kind of bespoke to Canada, but reflect some of the inner core similarities. This isn't unfamiliar in law. I mean, this is quite common in trade law, which focuses on this idea of interoperability between different regimes. But that fine print ends up being incredibly important. And I don't think we're wholly through this either. So, for example, we talk about the idea of data residency requirements as perhaps being a solution. But of course, we're facing right now a trade environment with the U.S. and Mexico, where at the moment, one of the key provisions in this was the promise that, there wouldn't be data residency requirements. And that is because they want to facilitate the free flow of trade. Well, that kind of makes things a little bit difficult. Or if you do set up the data in Canada, that doesn't mean that there isn't legal access to that data, which is, of course, the problem that we're seeing through the US with the US Cloud Act is that there's still rights of access to that particular data. So there's the security level of it, but then there's the fine print of law. And then there's also how we write laws in this particular space. So sovereignty legally is passing Canadian laws, but also thinking in terms of who do we have relationships with? Who do we want to operate with? And how do we want our regimes to be workable together in this new global environment to kind of the shared defenses that we need to fight these threats?
Thanks. So, for again coming at this as an operator, and I appreciate that framing. I think we've certainly been doing a fair bit of work at CIRA as well, and testing and seeing how we feel about the terminology and definitions, and I think that what we've come up with, which has been really helpful, and for us, what's important as being an infrastructure operator, is sovereignty is a notion of practical resilience, right? So, and this kind of feeds into both of what I think you both framed up, and particularly with what Sami was talking about. For us, we're starting to think about that largely in terms of in a crisis, in a conflict, in a disruption, in an extreme weather event, does Canada have the internet architecture, and does it have all of the fundamental plumbing in place and governance in place to be able to operate that infrastructure in the face of a disruption, conflict, or a major weather event? So the question is, if there's something happening on the East Coast, God forbid, can we quickly ensure that the routing and the traffic and the data packets that are coming to your computer and going from mine can actually do so in light of that? And to what extent are we dependent? Are we introducing or carrying on with dependencies in that environment that we don't really need to? So it's about avoiding unnecessary dependencies or over-dependence for us. One of the concrete ways that you asked me to think about this, and what we've been thinking about and recently have written about at CIRA in a couple of different pieces, is this notion of traffic routing in the country, and when is it okay for a Canadian a message that originates in Canada going to another Canadian, sometimes perhaps just down the block or across the country, doesn't matter. Why is it, or how is that traffic flowing? How are those packets moving? Are they moving through only Canadian infrastructure? Are they moving through other infrastructure like the United States, for example? And there are some studies that are showing, XMAPS did a study, one of their data sets showed at least 25% of Canada to Canada point traffic was moving through the United States. Some say that's low. Some say that's going to be a lot more, but that's a great example. And we would come at it, I think, from three ways there, just really quickly. One would be on performance. Look, the longer you have a path, the more latency you're going to have. It's just the physics, right? And now we're talking milliseconds here. That might not matter to you and I, but for high frequency trading, that matters. That matters a lot, right? For an F-35 that's moving across vast amounts of land, that's operating with potential autonomous systems, et cetera, that matters, right? So that's an important point of consideration. I think the resilience piece is, if we're connected, the more networks you're connected to, the more infrastructure you're connected to, the greater your threat surface, right? If something happens in Detroit and I'm connected and dependent on that, then all of a sudden, regardless of the fact that I'm in Newfoundland, I'm still out because Detroit's out. So let's talk about that. And then there's the privacy and national security implications of packets that are moving across infrastructures that don't have the necessary jurisdiction or legal protections, which we've talked about. So that's how we're starting to think about it. And one thing I would say about the routing is we're big proponents of internet exchange points at CIRA. That's a place, where there's a number of points across the country where Canadians can come together, both corporate and other organizations, and exchange traffic here. That's one concrete way that we can start moving towards less dependence.
Thank you. And sort of related to that last point, just so I don't have a question on this, so I just want to make sure we throw it out there. there are some opportunities in Canada, not as many as I would like to see, for sharing threat information, both at that technical level of the ones and zeros, but also at its sort of the more discussion level. So if you're an organization of any size in this country, you should look into the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. It's an organization with, at the moment, I think we're into hundreds, maybe it's the low thousands of companies, and it's everything from the big banks and the telcos down to my own law firm that I started up a year ago was the second law firm to join with a population of one. And I'll put in a plug for them. Being a member to that means you get access to the raw data streams if you've got the people that can work with that and interpret it and can contribute to it. You also get weekly threat calls where you just jump on a private call with a bunch of CISOs and people that really understand this stuff who tell each other what they're seeing. And those calls are fascinating. So if you feel like you're bowling alone here, there are places where you can get that sort of networking and exchange. And I really encourage more companies to do it than are. I want to move now to the skills gap, the training gap. And this is something that anyone that works in cyber, you hear about this all the time. We don't have enough people to work in cyber. There are more jobs than there are people. And we're still seeing an incredible amount of outsourcing, which is we try to move to a more sovereign framework and maybe a more tied down cyber system in this country. That becomes more problematic. I'd actually like each of you to weigh in on this. I'm going to start with you, Professor, because we're holding you accountable for what all the universities are doing. So we did have some thoughts about this on the previous panel. I'd love to know your thoughts in terms of where are we going to get these people? How are we going to train them? Good.
Yes. And I did say to Wendy earlier, I said, listening to you talk about universities was therapy for me. It's, they're bureaucratic. And I think that one of the things that we should be open about, too, is that they're operating in kind of problematic times where a lot of funding has been stripped of universities, both federally and provincially. I'm in a province, too, where the government is actually kind of interfering with the training itself to require certain outputs. So that sense of academic independence and university independence is being challenged. So you layer onto this the idea of training. Well, I'm trying to train lawyers, and I'm trying to prepare them for the landscape to come. And some of the things that we need is working across different specialties. So we did trial that at the University of Calgary. We sat down and talked to people at the CSE about what do you want? Like, what are you wanting out of your graduates so that we can start delivering that? And they're like, we're actually needing more of the generalists who can speak across different areas, who can be the lawyer, you can have a sense of international relations, have understanding of tech. We're like, fine, we will try to create that. The problem with the way universities are set up right now is that a lot of the times it's boring stuff. It's that the money doesn't flow to a department unless that student is primarily just taking a class in that department. So the types of joint programs we need to create require universities to fundamentally change how they operate. And as Wendy mentioned, that is really hard for them to do because each department needs money. And if that bum in seat is not bringing in money, then they can't keep the lights on. And then we've got a problem with training. So we're not actually providing some of the training that we need to be providing. And I think that the other, though, is that it's then left, professors are working really hard. I mean, Brent has come and spoke to my students. They absolutely loved it. Teach a privacy and cybersecurity law class. I run it like a lab, so we're doing simulations and trying to have them really work through on the ground what it was like, and without trying to be good at it. I mean, part of what they have to do is to come back and say, what was hard, what went wrong, what would I do different, where do I think this is difficult, because of the uncertain environment within which that you're giving that type of advice. But as you say, it's a kind of team effort. So building up almost the capacity of those trainers too. We're going to have a conversation later about the simulation that you were recently running, and I want to learn from that as well to improve what I'm doing. The federal government is providing more funding to build up the talent and the chairs that universities are kind of attracting from abroad. But more needs to be done, and it can't just come from the professors, and it can't just come from the universities themselves. This actually needs to be a broader investment in the kind of training we want to see.
Thanks. I'm thinking about in terms of how we approach it at CIRA, and I want to just kind of ground it again back in that operator perspective. I think one of the services we work to provision, we provide another service on training and around phishing, for example. It's automated. So we certainly have found, even myself, I have to admit, I've clicked on a link here and there. So the opportunity to actually live and breathe it in that kind of process of cybersecurity, more than just learning it on a page, right? So when an email comes into me that the system has generated that really understands where I'm more likely to be encouraged or incented to click, and having that happen in a safe environment, so I'm not blowing up the company network, has been very powerful. And I think we need to see more of that, right? And I know certainly CIRA is thinking about it, and we're thinking about bundling that with different services and products. So the actual physical experience of going through that process, as opposed to just learning on paper, that has, I think, a tremendous impact.
So I'll start at the CSE level and then maybe work it at the government level and then broader than that. So at CSE, we don't necessarily have a problem with skills, as we manage to fill the pipeline. Where we lose people is often it takes about a year to run through the process because of the clearances, the security clearances. So while we have a lot of candidates, some of them drop out because it's too long to wait about a year to basically join the organization. But we take them, generalist and specialist, and we then train them and offer them, the good training so that they reach a good level of competency in cyber. At the government level, we worked with the Canada School of Public Service to develop what is now a cybersecurity mandatory course to educate the public service at large. But I think we need to do more in that space, especially when it comes to AI. It's still often bandied around as a buzzword, and the good appreciation of what AI means is still something that I think we need to work on at all levels. So not just at the implementer level, but even at the executive level, to spend enough time for executive to appreciate what AI can do and AI can't do. Beyond government, I still think we that gap still exists, and it's going to get worse because of the threat surface is expanding. So it's not just about cybersecurity in IT network. I worry about operational technology, and do we have the right skill set out there to look at the cybersecurity of these operational networks, the big energy companies, the big transportation hubs, the HVAC systems, the building management system. All of these things are connected to the internet, and is there enough people who can appreciate the cybersecurity of those complex systems? But also, lastly, I would say that there was a role for organizations to educate their workforce also and invest in them. So it's not, how do we run enough phishing exercises so that people learn not to click on those and not make it punitive, but sort of course, unless you blow up the network, and then Charles will be fired. But how do we make it so that it becomes a sort of build that muscle memory that people can be trained on, not to click on the link and think twice about it. Some of the phishing emails we're seeing are super sophisticated, and when you combine that with a phone call, or you combine that with a video now that AI is delivering, like you really have at it for some of us. You really have to think twice. So how do we build that knowledge and that muscle memory so that at least that's one element of the threat surface that we can remove?
Anecdotally, I have a client that, and this came up yesterday, got an email from ostensibly the RCMP asking asking for production of a bunch of stuff. They're like, is this real? So we're in an environment where you can get an email from the RCMP and still not be sure it's real. I've actually, this luck would have it, I know the detachment, so I know the answer to the question. But yeah, there's a lot to do here. I just wanted to put out there as well, there's a role here in terms of finding opportunities for people who are in this space to sort of help out at the community level. We're now working, some organizations are working at spinning up some hubs in different regional centers that can help small and medium-sized organizations that can't afford to have a full-time CISO or the sort of on-prem workforce to work on this stuff, to give them the sort of basic advice they need. The first one of them has spun up in Victoria, and it's doing tremendous work. So more to come on that in the future, I hope. Yeah, please.
Last night I was at an event right here at the John A. MacDonald building for Coding for Veterans. And that's a program with the University of Ottawa that takes veterans, and they ran 1,000 veterans so far through the program. And 70% of them have found jobs sort of post-military career. So this is an example of sort of contributing to the community and building that knowledge of the art.
So glad you mentioned that. Thank you. I saw that. Yeah. All right. We've got a few minutes left, so we're going to do a lightning round here. These are for anyone that wants to answer them. So starting with this one, what's one cyber risk Canadians are still underestimating? Just throw up your hand if you want to take this. Anyone?
Just about food. So just say one word: phishing.
That was sense.
Yeah, phishing is still the bane of our existence. I agree. And what we're starting to see now, statistically, more than ransomware attacks, are just more and more business email compromises, we call them, which usually start with the phishing email. Absolutely. What's one resilience measure that should be getting more attention than it's getting in the national conversation?
So, passwords and MFA.
Two things. Say more than 2 words.
I'm passing to you two on the.
Risen. Go. Well, I'm going to go back to what I said before. I think we should be talking a little bit more about routing.
Interesting. On the technical side, I'm always going to defer to them because I like to stick clearly in my lane on law, but those sound good too. And I would actually echo that. I think that the MFA criteria and also just building buy-in from organizations on that, I think it's still difficult to convince employees that it is important and not just a pain in accessing and doing the work they need to do.
Want to elaborate? Yeah, different password for every system. I know it's a pain, but that makes a huge difference. Use a password manager to store those different passwords, so don't write them and stick them under your laptop. Patch your system and keep them up to date. And where possible, I would say enable multi-factor authentication. Those are the 3 things that every Canadian.
Absolutely. And they use a different password for everything one is one they don't talk about enough, because the problem is if your password gets leaked in some data breach and you use the same password for everything, and if you're using 123 password, leave the room now. If you're using the same password for other accounts, people will figure that out, because those data, they automate and they just run all these passwords against any website. And if you happen to have an account there with the same email address and the same account, your data is now available to them in this other service. Absolutely. What does Canada need more of right now in terms of law reform or infrastructure or investment or better routing or people with more hands-on skills? So I'm going to really dumb this down and make you pick one thing, which is not at all how this works. Pick your favorite. Yeah.
My answer will not be surprising, and I will remember this is a lightning round, but Canada is behind on passing laws and comprehensive laws in this particular space. There's been a lot of efforts and movements on digital policy that have, for the most part, except for a few like the critical infrastructure bill, died out. And there needs to be far greater coordination between the federal and provincial governments. I talked about interoperability internationally. I didn't talk about how important that is within our own country, and I do appreciate the irony of me saying that coming from Alberta. But that is, I think, some of the key moves forward is we need to actually think, what do clear, comprehensive laws look in this space that don't create needless business complexity, or but also provide the right incentives and outcomes that we're hoping for.
Can I go a little meta at first? Getting to this, I think we need processes, whether that's law or whether that's what we're doing to facilitate or keep innovation here in Canada. We need to move a lot more quickly in general. We need to find ways in terms of our processes to move more quickly. The machine speed at which these threats are growing is only accelerating, and it's already moving damn near at light speed. So we really do need to work faster, and we do need more investment. It's just we really do need more investment. I think the NATO targets are going to help. I think that we as a country should be thinking about really ensuring that we take advantage of this opportunity and really stick in on investment in cyber and infrastructure.
I would say two things. One is culturally, we need to take a bigger chance on Canadian innovation. I don't think it's a procurement issue. I think it's a cultural issue that, we like to buy things from well-established company, but it's a risk to buy something from a small innovator in Canada. How do we change that attitude? And the other thing is, how do we push the cybersecurity curriculum further down, almost to elementary school, and get people to grow up with a kind of a digital mindset and not wait till you get to university to learn about computer science and sort of cybersecurity. Get same way that a kid knows when they get in a car to put the seatbelt. How do you make sure that when they get their first phone that they know how to secure it?
On that point, I spun up a new laptop for my kid last year, and I just set a very basic password just so she could get on it. And the first thing she did was say, "Really? That's the password you picked?" So excellent point. I think that we're going to stop it there. Thank you so much for this, and hopefully you can stick around and talk to some of our people here. Thanks so much.